Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Chuck Friedman. I'm one of the co-chairs of the LHS Collaboratory, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Collaboratory to today's special event. We're very fortunate to have Tony Brike as our featured speaker, as well as two outstanding discussants, Elizabeth Moge, the Dean of the School of Education, and Karen Stolberg, a faculty member in the Department of Learning Health Sciences. We will now begin the webinar. I'm delighted that you're all here. Our MC for today is going to be our colleague Don Puerac from the School of Education. Don is a regular participant in the Collaboratory. We're delighted to have him as a colleague. And at this point, I will turn things over to Don. Don, thank you very much.
Thanks, Chuck, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I'd like to take just a few minutes to set some context for today's session. As we've discussed in the LHS Collaboratory over the past several years, the power and the promise of learning health systems lies in their potential to leverage new organizational forms, new technologies, new sources of data to accelerate and scale the production, the use, and the continuous improvement of practical knowledge in the medical sector. A parallel movement is playing out in the education sector that's aimed at drawing diverse educational organizations into new types of learning systems characterized by collaborative, continuous learning and improvement focused keenly on the practical problems of teachers and educational leaders. This movement is playing out in interaction with three broad trends. The first is a shift beyond a policy focus on improving equal access to public schooling to ensuring excellence and equity in students' educational opportunities, their experiences, and their outcomes once they're in schools. A second shift is from a resource-forward approach to educational innovation and improvement to a practice-forward approach to educational innovation and improvement. The premise underlying the resource-forward approach is that educational quality can be improved and disparities reduced by the production of more and better educational resources distributed more equitably among districts and networks and schools and classrooms. The premise underlying the practice-forward approach is that educational quality can be improved and disparities reduced by producing and using knowledge to address specific problems and needs and opportunities grounded deeply in the specific practice contexts of teachers and educational leaders. And the third broad trend is a shift beyond bureaucratic organizational forms to new types of networked organizational forms as contexts in and through which to produce and use and refine practical knowledge. And in those trends, I think you can see close parallels to some of what's motivating the learning health systems movement in the medical sector. Next slide, please. Today, we have the opportunity to learn more about this improvement movement in education from Tony Brike. Tony is the 9th president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. Prior to assuming the presidency, Tony's academic and professional journeys took him from Boston College to Harvard University, to the University of Chicago, and to Stanford University. And along the way, he became a member of the National Academy of Education and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he published too many books and articles and blogs to mention. As related to today's talk, most important to know is that under his leadership, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching has become a key catalyst and driver of this improvement movement in education. Under Tony's leadership, the foundation has led on-the-ground efforts to establish proof of concept through initiatives aimed at improving instruction, the organization and management of instruction, and student outcomes in networks of K-12 schools and community colleges. The foundation has led the development of methods and resources and professional learning opportunities, currently supporting hundreds of improvement initiatives in the US and in other countries. And the foundation, importantly, is leading field building efforts aimed at coalescing the improvement community in education to raise its profile and influence in policy practice and in academic communities. After hearing from Tony about the improvement movement in education, we'll hear comments from Elizabeth Moji and Karen Stahlberg. Elizabeth is the Dean of the School of Education, which has her, among many other things, leading to establish the school at Marygrove. This is a cradle to career public school located at the Marygrove College campus in northwestern Detroit that also serves as a site for a novel 3-year residency program for novice teachers inspired by the medical school model of professional education. As many of you know, Karen is an associate professor of learning health sciences, an associate professor of obstetrics and gynecology, and director of the HILS online master's program. And as many of you might not know, Karen is also an alum of the School of Education, where she earned her MA in the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education. Throughout Tony's talk and the subsequent remarks from Elizabeth and Karen, please feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A pod, which we'll monitor throughout. We've reserved 2 opportunities to address questions, first after Tony's comments, and second after comments from Elizabeth and Karen. With that as context, it's my great pleasure to turn things over to Tony Brake. Tony, welcome back to the University of Michigan and welcome to the LHS Collaboratory.
All right. No crises so far. Let me begin with a little bit about myself and my own learning to improve journey. For most of my professional life, I have had the privilege of living in elite research universities. A good portion of that life was spent at the University of Chicago. And I joined the faculty there in 1985. And most of my faculty colleagues at that time paid little attention to the disadvantaged communities surrounding the University of Chicago. There was a sense that we do serious academic research here, and the kind of neighborhoods around us aren't really part of that. There are exceptions, of course, but the general ethos seemed fairly clear. So there I was sitting in that great university when former US Secretary of Education, Bill Bennett, had visited Chicago, called it the worst public school system in America. Academic success rates were in the 20% range. High school dropout rates hovered around 50%. This was a district, 90% low-income students, 90% students of color. This was institutionalized inequity, organized along lines of race and poverty. I had to believe that there was something meaningful we could do. And so I began the work of the Center for School Improvement and then the Consortium on Chicago School Research. However, back then, this is the late 1980s, it was hard to find a major research university anywhere that was engaged in a serious connection to its local public schools. The idea of research practice partnerships didn't exist. Making this work come alive in Chicago for me forced me to confront the limits of what I actually knew. I was suddenly working well outside the comfort zone of the academic expertise that had brought me to the university. I didn't exactly know how to do any of this. All I knew is that I thought trying mattered. This quest took me into working directly with teachers, parents, principals, school community leaders in some of Chicago's most disadvantaged neighborhoods. I had occasion to work with and learn from some of the best professional educators around the country who are working primarily in the area of improving literacy in elementary and middle schools. And along the way, I also had the opportunity to work on teams that were involved in starting a new school on the south side of Chicago, a new urban teacher preparation program, that sought to assure that all of its graduates not only knew how to teach well, but engage well and sustain themselves well in some of Chicago's most challenging school communities. And I even did a foray for a period of time working inside the central office of the Chicago Public Schools. All that I learned from the people whom I engaged with in doing this work informed my efforts in starting and leading the Consortium on Chicago School Research. The consortium was the first organization of its kind, seeking to assemble an outstanding research and analytic capacity, but with this very targeted focus on improving schools in a particular place, the city of Chicago. It was about bringing the best possible evidence to bear in ongoing conversations across the city about the current state of reform and the next steps ahead in improving Chicago's schools. We were cultivating contexts for social learning around school improvement. So in looking back now, I was actually both thinking and doing a lot of the work of what we now call learning to improve, but doing it well before any words were ever written. That work in Chicago eventuated in this book called Organizing Schools for Improvement. And in shorthand, what we can say about that work is that it focused on these called the 5 essential supports, with extensive empirical validation that if teams and school buildings worked in these 5 areas, there was good empirical evidence that one would see improvements in student engagement and student academic outcomes as measured by the then conventional tests, academic tests that districts were using. This, all of this work really, in a sense, these 5 essential supports focused attention on what we should do. And that was really important because when you think about schools, they're complex organizations, and we could look at lots of different things. And one of the key principles in improvement science is that 80% of the variation in outcomes is generally associated with about 20% of the causes. So that if you can find those 3 to 5 big drivers and really work on them, you could improve schools. So even before we were talking about improvement science, this book really captured, these are the 5 big things to work on in trying to improve schools. All right, so along the way, I became much more focused, shifting from the what question to what I would call the how question. How do we actually get this to happen at something more than occasional events? So it's the shift from the what to the how. And this is where I began to become a student of the work in improvement science. And although I'd read about W. Edwards Deming earlier in my work, got very much reconnected to him. And Deming said about educational reform that we were characterized by miracle goals and no methods. He said this in 1991 when we had Goals 2000. And looking back, it seems apropos to have described No Child Left Behind that way. Also seems clear that it could be applied to the movement into the Common Core standards or new standards more generally. And seems equally plausible today as we think about whatever new initiatives will come forward, especially in this post-COVID-19 era. Miracle goals and no methods. So this really had us focused here at the Carnegie Foundation over the last dozen years or so on 2 very big questions. One, how is it that our educational organizations can continuously get better at what they do? The first part of Deming's question. And then bringing it home even into a more contemporary scene where we're seeing change occurring at an extraordinary pace, brought on by the fact that we live now in a global society where technology is fueling enormous transformation in the way we work and live. What this means is that the aspirations we have for our schools will almost surely continue to change, and in all likelihood at an accelerating rate. So not only do our schools need to learn how to get better, we have to accelerate this learning to improve, both on the complex challenges we already confront, as well as the new ones that are likely to arise in the years ahead. So again, organizing schools for improvement focused attention on what I call the what question, and learning to improve began to open up what we called an improvement paradigm. How might we actually get better at getting better? That paradigm is captured in 6 core principles. It starts with the observation that many of the problems we're trying to solve these days are far too complex for an individual teacher, most individual teachers, individual schools, or even districts to solve on their own. We need to organize networks that bring in the best of practical expertise, research, knowledge, and other forms of expertise if we're really going to make headwork on these kind of problem solving. In doing this work, no matter where you see it, whether you see it in a small improvement group, say inside even a school, or you begin to see it in cross-site collaboratives, what you'll see is that they're focused on very specific problems they're trying to solve, and there's deep attention to understanding these problems through the perspective, through the actual experiences and emotions of the people who are engaged in doing that work. We refer to this as being user-centered. At the core of this improvement is that there's very wide variability in outcomes. This is a general characteristic of complex organizations. They produce wide variability in outcomes. So we're attending to that variability, and we're trying to understand how the systems we operate contribute to the creation of that wide variability. So we have to see and understand these systems if we're to have any chance of improving them. That moves us then into what I would call the empirical side of the work, whereas we begin to develop hypotheses, if you will, about the changes that might actually address these problems that we've identified, how we engage in rapid inquiries and bring measurement to bear in helping us to learn whether the changes we're introducing are actually an improvement. But one of the themes in my talk is that when we talk about measurement and improvement, we're generally talking about different kinds of data than the kinds of things that have been the focus of school and teacher accountability systems. And we're talking about data not so much not to hold people accountable, but rather data to inform their efforts to actually make progress on the specific problems that are focusing their attention. And then finally, we're working on this idea of accelerating the learning across the network. As new ideas begin to get tried out, typically in small contexts, how these get shared, how knowledge gets consolidated across the network working on a common problem, and thereby accelerate the capacity of larger enterprises to achieve quality outcomes reliably at scale. Really tapping into the power of social learning, of large networks, and education is the quintessential large network where we have millions of people doing highly related work every day. So we have this incredible resource that to date we've not really tapped, but that holds tremendous potential for accelerating how we learn to improve. All right, so learning to improve set out these principles with some tools and methods and some illustrative cases. But as we got into this work, and we actually alluded to at the end of learning to improve, that this is somewhat easier to say than it is to actually do. And over the last 5 years, what we've really been focusing more of our attention on is what does it mean to take on these practices of continuous improvement and to engage them with quality, which led us to our most recent book on improvement in action, which is about the actual doing of improvement in educational settings. How do you take those principles, make them come alive to actually solve important problems of inequities in our educational systems? The book is organized around 6 stories. 2 of these are school districts: Fresno Unified School District in Central Valley in California, and the Menomonee Falls District, which is just outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. 2 of the cases come from very innovative charter management organizations. Summit Public Schools, which centers in San Diego, California. Summit Public Schools is in California and Washington, and High Tech High is in San Diego. And 2 are intermediate organizations working with large school networks. New Visions for Public Schools in New York City, which supports some 80 high schools in the city of New York, and the National Writing Project, which is a national organization with some 200 local sites supporting writing improvement all across the United States. All right, so first, Fresno Unified School District. Their problem, referred to as the student undermatching problem. They're in the process of getting more students to get through high school and go on to post-secondary. One of the things we know about students moving into post-secondary is that there tends to be this undermatching problem. They can actually, many of these students coming out of disadvantaged school districts can actually get admitted to more selective institutions, and their probabilities of completing college tend to be dramatically improved if they go to a more selective institution. They tend to have more supports behind them, including better financial aid. And so getting students to apply up often is a key to advancing their success. That was the problem that Fresno Unified School District was taking on. In the course of their attacking this problem, we're able to see a key organizational metaphor, the leaky pipeline, where as they looked at students going from entry to high school to actually applying to a university, to one of the University of California campuses, where are they losing students along the way? This organizational metaphor, leaky pipeline. Well, the first place that this happens as students come into high school is that to apply to the University of California system, you have to enroll in and complete a set of courses called the A to G courses. So losing a lot of students right there because they weren't enrolling in the proper courses. You also have to get an acceptable grade in those courses. And in some cases that wasn't happening. And so they were losing students who might fail one of the particular A to G courses. And so that led to adding credit recovery programs. As you began to get closer to applying to college, you had to take the SAT. And that generally wasn't offered in the community in which these students lived, which meant going to some less welcoming environment to sit for this very challenging assessment. So what the district did is they negotiated with ETS that the SAT could be given on a school day in the student's home school. So that was another place they had been losing students. The application process itself through the personal statement, the FAFSA, large number of steps, lots of places along the way you could lose students there. So they built a support system there as well. And then finally, even when they had students who actually had been accepted into a college, they found that they would lose students over the summer, what they call the summer melt program. So they attacked that as well. All of these steps, working on each of these different processes, was key to dramatically improving the application rate and the matriculation rate of students into more selective California public institutions. Shifting to New Visions for Public Schools. here, their work from one angle of view looks pretty basic. They're focusing on how administrative systems operate in high schools that contribute to their high school graduation problem. This is not the kind of thing on the face of it that one would think about engaging, for example, serious academic research on. And in fact, most practitioners just accepted the way these systems work as just kind of taken for granted. But they understood that they needed to probe into these more deeply. And these are systems like how attendance is taken, how students get assigned to courses, how grades are recorded, and so on. A key analytic perspective emerges from the New Visions case, which is this attention to the flows of students over time, rather than just looking at what I would call cross-sections of data at the finish line. In this case here, where they're focusing on high school graduation, the cross-section is, well, how many students graduated this year? How many graduated last year? We'll slice and dice this data by various race and ethnic subgroups and special education groups and so on, but that's standing at the finish line. They were looking at the flows of students, which I'll illustrate in a moment. And you see something different often when you focus on the flows of students as compared to just looking at data at the finish line. They introduce, and we see this concept, this change concept, actually operating across all of the 6 stories, which is to get the right information to the right people at the right time so that they can actually act on it. The kind of information that appears in school report cards that tends to come out at the end of the year, which tends to organize our accountability systems, very useful for those purposes, but that data generally isn't timely in terms of actually trying to do something if a problem is emerging right in front of you. So right information to the right people at the right time. This turns out to be a very important change concept. And then in their work, there's also a very key change, which is drilling down into the actual work that people do, seeing those processes. And they did a fair amount of design, testing and redesign work on what they called a strategic data check-in process. They're going to get the right information into the right people's hands. And how do you create good conversation routines? And what does the right visualization look like so that people can, so that a school-based team looking at data on the progress of students would know what to attend to and have productive conversations about what they might do next. This might seem very straightforward. And so much of what you tend to see, and which I've become highly attuned to, is that in education, you get to points in the operation of organizations where the tacit norm is of the form, well, everybody's got to figure this out on their own. And whenever you get to that point, you'll tend to see wide variability in performance. If in certain processes we're actually losing students, these are the places where we need to really develop good field-generated work processes. And this is an example of that. And the other thing that emerges from the New Visions case is you begin to see the power of an analytic hub that's actually supporting the work of an improvement community. Here's one of the visualizations, early visualizations, that was developed by New Visions. And it is very much on looking at the data on the flows of students, in this case, across high schools. And if you look at the far end, this is the finish line data. And for this particular high school, Tele High School, about 80% of their students receive some form of a Regents diploma in New York. And at the time they were starting this work, that's actually quite a good outcome. So if you were just scoring the high school on its Regents diploma rate, you'd say, well, Tele's looks like they're doing pretty well. But when you actually look at the flows of students over time, and particularly this area, what's in red, the students are off track, which then move into students dropping out. You notice that there's an increasing number of students falling into this off track and that much of this is happening in that off-track rate literally almost doubles at the end of the first year. They do a little bit better, and then it doubles again at the end of the second year. So it's focusing your attention on what's happening to students as they first come into high school that's causing students to fall off track, and in some cases change their actual life course of completing high school or not. So looking at the flows of the data actually gets you to see something and focus your improvement attention in ways that might otherwise not be the case. Here's another one. Here's another example of this. This is an example that comes from early literacy work. It's the data that's generated by Amplify, who are the commercial distributors of Dibbles, which is the largest assessment operating in these grades in the United States. And this is some of their results. And it's on their fluency assessment, words per minute of students at the end of first grade. And what you see in these data is that there's a subset of students at the end of first grade who showing very weak fluency, less than about 35 words per minute. And any student who falls in that category, 9 out of 10 of them will not be proficient 2 years later, be a proficient reader 2 years later by the end of grade 3. That's what I would call a predictable failure. We see this, and yet we continue to reproduce this year after year after year, because we're not actually focusing attention on, if we know this, what might we actually do to change this outcome? So the flows, looking at the data longitudinally, brings this kind of example forward. What tends to happen in a case like this, we're really focusing on weak levels of achievement, is that we encounter what's referred to as, what might be referred to as new program thinking. Well, we got to bring a new program in. And right now, a lot of attention, last several years, has been on bringing new curriculum, particularly curriculum aligned to the Common Core. And yes, and then we offer professional development about the curriculum, often from people who provide that curriculum. And then we have this expectation that the end of year test scores should improve. And for that to happen, well, something's going to change in classrooms that's actually going to allow this to occur. Unfortunately, we have good evidence that this is often not the case. This is a major study conducted by the Center for Educational Policy Research at Harvard, comparing results in 6 different states that had brought in Common Core aligned tests, and on average, didn't seem to do very much. I bring this example up because this is some work that I am now directly engaged in with the Baltimore City Public Schools, in which one of their, what they call their blueprint for improvement, one of their primary elements in their blueprint for improvement is a focus on middle grades literacy outcomes. And as part of that, they actually are following the strategy of adopting a very highly rated Common Core aligned curriculum and including professional development. But they're doing more than that. They have actually brought an improvement orientation to their work. And of course, the focus is on getting better literacy outcomes at the end of 8th grade, so students are better prepared to succeed in high school. But in the course of their work, their analytics sub-team actually looked at the flows of students in their middle grades, 6 through 8, and what students look like at entry into 6th grade, and what happens to them over the next 3 years. And when they looked at this data, they saw something quite astounding. Approximately a third or more, depending on the year, of their students had demonstrable weaknesses in very basic literacy skills, phonics and fluency. And of that subgroup, a third or more of the students, 98% of those students would not be judged proficient in language arts 3 years later. That's as close to a perfect predictable failure as you're ever going to see. And when they became user-centered and began to go out and talk with teachers about what was going on, the teachers recognized this problem. The new curriculum really didn't deal with it because presumably these are things that are supposed to be addressed in the primary grades, but there were still large numbers of students in the middle grades for whom this was a concern. Teachers hadn't received any professional development to support them in this area. And they knew it was important for students, but they didn't know what to do. And so this kind of really understanding the problems, and I emphasize the word problems, that one needs to solve becomes really key in trying to achieve the aims that these aspirations we hold all students, productive readers and writers. All right, so it takes us, and so these examples all coming, there are multiple examples coming out of this New Visions analytic work, really focus us in on that second and third improvement principles. You got to see how the systems, how they operate, are actually creating the unacceptable variability in outcomes. And when I say unacceptable variability in outcomes, this is almost always connected to issues of inequity in outcomes, because that variability in outcomes is not randomly distributed. It unfortunately tends to follow in patterns well too structured along issues of race, ethnicity, income, and the like. All right, Summit Public Schools. Another story. This one's really interesting because as a charter school organization, they, along with High Tech High, are among the two most highly innovative high school transformation organizations in the United States. Summit's aim in forming their charter network was tantamount to reinventing the contemporary high school. They wanted to break down the egg crate structure. They wanted students to become more active agents of their own learning. They'd have more choice in what they do on a day-by-day basis. Teachers would no longer be the sage in front of classrooms. They now be advisors and mentors to individual students. Students would be allowed to work at their own pace. So this is a fundamental reorganization of the American high school. As they got into this work, a novel problem emerged, not one that was common in high schools, in contemporary high schools. The problem of what they call student incompletes. Well, if students are working at their own pace, some students clearly are accelerating, moving forward, but others are left behind, making slower progress, and most importantly, by the end of the academic year, have not completed sufficient bodies of work to meet the standards for that academic year. So this really gets them focused on a core improvement concept, this issue of reliability. They have these incredible aspirations that they aspire to put into action. But the question is, how do you get this to work every day for every student and in every learning context? How to get quality outcomes reliably. All right, this led Summit to invest in a big internal human capital investment that involves improving capabilities among school staff, including creating parts of teachers on special assignment, freeing them up to lead improvement work on this problem at the school building level. Similar to what we saw in High Visions, in New Visions, the building of a central analytic capacity to inform these efforts and to bring data forward, the right information to the right people at the right time so that they could act on it. and a hub team to access relevant knowledge, what research knowledge might exist out in the academy that could help folks understand and take more productive actions here. And then to consolidate the improvement learning, because this improvement learning is now occurring in a network of many teachers and schools. Shifting to High Tech High, that other highly innovative charter school network. This is a place where improvement science went deep in a most unexpected context. I say that because the founding norms of High Tech High really in two ways would seem on the surface to be antithetical to improvement science. The first was a distrust of data, particularly of standardized test data and the way these data had been used in accountability systems. And the second was a very strong embrace of teacher autonomy. Their expression for it was every teacher a designer. So this idea that we might use evidence to improve and that teachers would work in some form of structured networks rather than working solely as independent designers was a substantial normative challenge at the beginning. But what brought people together was a powerful aspiration. They were deeply committed to prepare every one of their students to graduate high school and succeed in college. And as they actually looked more, and for a while they thought they were doing it, but when they actually looked more systematically at data, and especially data on what happened to the students after they left them, they realized they actually had an improvement problem. There was a large gap between their aspiration and what was actually happening to their students. So this is an interesting story of a major organizational change effort that had this organic kind of development character. They had small groups of teachers initially working together on some modest improvement projects. Other teachers sort of take notice of this. The network leaders are encouraging teachers to do so, providing professional development support. So you're going from a few early adopters to beginning to build a larger number of educators working within the schools, doing improvement projects. And now today, High Tech operates multiple networked improvement communities across its schools and has even begun to be host to network improvement communities, including nearby public schools. And most interestingly, it's woven improvement science into its graduate school of education to enable the next generation of teachers and school leaders to learn to work in these new ways. So that's the work of High Tech High. Both the Summit Schools case and the High Tech High case are cases of fundamental organizational change that organically developed out of relatively small scale work and growing over a period of time to come to characterize the whole of the organization. Menomonee Falls case, in contrast, is a case of another case of transforming a whole school system, but where this is taken on as part of the deliberate efforts of the school system leadership. Almost from day one, everyone in the schools, teachers, auxiliary staff, operational personnel, board members, leadership team, students, they're all trained in these basic ideas and tools and methods of continuous improvement. Structures and routines are put in place to coordinate improvement efforts up and down the system, from what's going on in classrooms up to what gets to how in 45-day reports to the school board. The school board is now hearing about improvement efforts and brainstorming about how better to support those efforts. Over a period of about 4 or 5 years, this work becomes institutionalized in the district, so that if you visited Menomonee Falls now, you would describe this is just their norm. This is just, people will say, this is just how we do our work here. the work in Menomonee Falls is actually reminds me of some other work we've been engaged in with folks in the state of Kentucky, this is a statewide initiative on improving mathematics learning. And it draws on insights from implementation science, which is a little bit like what was operating in Menomonee Falls, where if you're actually trying to get this kind of improvement work to occur reliably at scale, you have to see every level at which people are working and how the subsequent levels are learning from the practice of others while they're also simultaneously supporting the improvement of practice. So in the Kentucky work, they had school level teams. Those were in turn supported by district level teams, regional teams, and so on. And at each level, what you're seeing is the role of that level is to support the improvement of practices for the groups, if you will, below them, while they're simultaneously learning from that practice so that they can get better in the support of others. And if you think about this work just inside a district, there are actually multiple levels of that have to operate even inside a large urban district, so that, for example, as instructional initiatives go into schools, as in the Baltimore case we're working in, there's quite naturally a tension on working with teachers and instructional coaches. But the next level up are the school principals, and they may not actually be, and school level instructional leadership teams. Above them, you've got regional superintendents that are people, among other things, who are responsible for holding the principals accountable for their work. And then you move into the system center, and there are teams there as well. And finally, you get to the senior cabinet. And this idea that each group is supporting the improvement practice of the other, and there should be learning from the practices. Well, this is just not the way new initiatives tend to get implemented in school districts. And this is very much the kind of work that's now occurring in Baltimore. Last of the 6 stories, the National Writing Project. And here we're moving, what I describe this is moving to the improvement frontier, where the improvement work is actually focusing directly on teaching and learning. Most of the other cases that I was describing are focused on what we might call status attainment issues, issues of chronic absenteeism, for example, getting students into the right classes, continuing to move forward through high school, and so on. This work, in contrast, put the improvement of students' argument writing, which became a big press as the Common Core standards got taken up. How do we actually improve students' argument writing? Because this historically has not been a major focus of language arts instruction, and it is a major component of the Common Core standards. Well, one of the big resources of the National Writing Project is that they've been in existence now for multiple decades. And so they have this large network of expertise of National Writing Project teachers, and the participants in the Writing Project. There are these strong relationships of trust that exist within these local National Writing Project site. Each site is in essence a research practice connection, because they have they have co-directors, someone from the academy and someone from a public school system. And so they had a social infrastructure, if you will, that could be quickly mobilized to attack an instructional improvement problem of this sort. But to actually make progress, they found as they got into this work that they had to invent a practical measure, this thing called the using sources tool, to inform their improvement efforts. This is an example of this. This is this using sources tool. It actually had a couple of other items, but it's got 8 items that are associated with it, and that basically represent their understanding, shared understanding, developed collectively in the network, of what it means, how one looks at should look at a piece of students' writing and what makes this a quality piece of student writing. Well, why does this matter? Well, as they began the work on improving students' argument writing, internal to the National Writing Project, they had their version of what I call the Tower of Babel problem. This was a complex problem to solve, how to improve argument writing, but they lacked any shared language about, well, what forms a good argument and what represents a good written example of an argument. Absent a shared language, they couldn't make much progress on this work early on. So their work helped to illumine a key improvement network concept, which is this idea of boundary objects and also boundary processes that are instrumental in the social formation of improvement networks. To get the community to agree on that using sources tool. Yeah, this makes sense. We're going to use this. We're going to use this individually as we look at student writing. We're going to use the same framework as we bring examples of student writing together in our professional development. As we introduce changes over time, we're going to use the data from that using sources tool to help tell us whether the changes we're introducing are an improvement. And we're going to track the results of that using sources tool to how end of the year writing assessments, whether we're seeing improvements there. It became a key boundary object to organize the conversations across an improvement network about what it meant to actually improve students' argument writing. Lastly, I said I'd say something about I'd say something about our field building efforts, and I know I'm running over, so I'll be very quick here. Basically, in terms of our efforts at the foundation to try to move this kind of work into the field, we're currently engaged in 4 streams of activity. One is we're trying to support the movement, and it has a very immediate focus, because as these ideas are being taken up in the field, how can we support practicing educators? The Summit on Improvement, which is this very unusual national event that we run every year, where we draw together teams from school districts, researchers from colleges of education, folks from charter management organizations, and other entrepreneurs, where they come together because the summit is organized around shared problems of practice and the work of people trying to advance improvement on those problems. Spotlight is where we draw attention to where these kinds of initiatives have actually demonstrated measurable improvements at some scale. Those are like the cases I've just described. And we have a set of course offerings, because as interest in this has exploded, people want, well, how can I learn about this? And the capacities to teach this well currently are in limited supply in our colleges of education and also in other professional organizations. But so that's the immediate focus. The intermediate focus is trying to build capabilities for this kind of work to occur in professional schools of education. The iLead work focuses on moving this work into leadership preparation programs in colleges of education, and in particular, how those leadership preparation programs work and practice improvement partnerships with targeted local school districts. The Raise Texas Teacher Initiative is something similar, in this case in the state of Texas, on how to move these ideas into teacher preparation programs. So that first stream of work is on people who are actually out in districts doing the work now. The intermediate focus is on the people coming into districts as teachers or taking on leadership roles in the future. Third strand of work is cultivating communities of leaders, and this I call the long game. And here we're focused in 3 areas. One is the Improvement Scholars Network, which began 2 years ago, of which Don Purak at the U of M, along with Jen Russell at the University of Pittsburgh, had been convening these improvement scholars. We have a Professional Practice Leaders Network, which are folks like those who, from the 6 cases I've just described, who've actually been engaged in doing improvement work and demonstrated measurable improvements and creating a professional leadership group out of them. And we're now in conversations with the Aspen Institute about what would a supportive policy community look like. And then finally, we live this principle of learning by doing, and we continue to directly address and engage in a small number of partnerships to fuel our own learning, because there's still so much more that we don't understand. The underlying strategy of all of this is that this is not a set of programs. It's really more akin to a movement or a journey. We're focusing on now, but we're also looking for the immediate horizon and how to influence the more distant future. We're in relationship to an enormous sector of activity, and you have to kind of seize the opportunities in the environment to grow a movement like this. As I mentioned, we continue to support improvement inquiries that solve specific educational inequities reliably at scale, and we want to bring attention to them when these efforts succeed, because quite simply, we need more proof cases. And we recognize that the journey will be long, that one has to hunker down and stay the course if fundamental changes are actually to occur. So this is not some 5 or 6 year initiative and then you go on and do something else, but this is a generation's work. Thank you for opportunities to share these ideas with you, and my apologies for running a bit over.
I was just going to ask if you could share with folks the ways in which the work that you've been describing drew on inspiration and relationships from key partners in the healthcare sector.
Yes, this is very interesting. As I mentioned early on, at the time I was not using the language of improvement science or networked improvement communities when I was doing the work in Chicago. But through that work, I had very much come to conclude that we needed a different kind of applied research and development infrastructure in education that could better support this kind of practical problem solving that I've been describing. And a good colleague of mine who in Chicago at the time, he was actually at Northwestern, was Luis Gomez. And both of us were deeply engaged in this kind of work in the Chicago public schools, and had written this paper in 2007 about what this alternative might look like. And we got to present it at a conference. And quite interesting, quite by accident, also invited to that conference was Don Berwick from Institute for Healthcare Improvement. And we were asked to do the opening plenary. And Don spoke later in the afternoon about the work of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. And Liz and I were sitting next to each other as Don was talking. And about partway through his talk, we kind of looked to each other and we said, this thing we're thinking about exists. It just exists in an entirely other sector. And so we became, that encouraged me to become essentially a student of improvement as it was being enacted in healthcare. So Don graciously invited me to visit, and I spent a number of weeks at IHI over the next year or so. We took study teams to IHI. Subsequently, we learned about the incredible work that was going on at Cincinnati Children's, and Uma Kataga, whom I think is on this session, invited us to bring a group there as well. And we've become kind of fellow travelers. The improvement science work was much more deeply advanced in the healthcare space, and what they used to call collaboratories, although I think they're now calling networks. What they're now calling improvement networks also exist there. So there's a lot of learning going on back and forth between us. And I've read lots of improvement cases in healthcare and actually went to their scientific symposium, which IHI runs a couple of times. So a real learning opportunity for me.
Well, thanks for that. And one quick question before we get comments from Elizabeth and Karen. One question from Ann Sales in the Q&A. She asks, can you say more about the data source for this interesting and important work? Are there standardized databases at a national level, or does data work have to be done at more local levels? Are standardized data about students and teachers as well as specific schools available, as well as outcome data?
This is a place where the improvement work in education is most notably different from the improvement work in healthcare. In part because how the financing system of healthcare works, where you got to document everything for payment systems. But there's just much more detailed data that exists inside of healthcare systems than in education. What we have in education is a lot of what I would call accountability data. So the end of the year test score results, more recently, data on coming out of teacher evaluation systems. A lot of data that tends to be organized, well, for example, attendance data. We have great attendance data because school districts get reimbursed for attendance data, but that data tends to be organized. It's what exists at the end of the academic year versus something like looking at chronic absenteeism, which is a characteristic of a student evolving over time. But generally, if you think, for those who are familiar with this logic of a driver diagram and improvement work, we tend to have pretty good data for what would go into the aim statement, because what tends to go in aim statements tends to be the kind of data that comes out of accountability systems. It's test scores, it's dropout rates, things of that sort. And then we have change ideas, which exist on the right-hand side of this driver diagram. And they're usually a whole set of causal connections that are hypothesized, hopefully hypothesized, some cases more tacitly assumed, but how that change is going to result in that improvement. But when you get in that middle space, there's often no actual data already collected, so that you're pretty much like in the National Writing Project example, you're actually inventing new measures. And that was actually true in the New Visions case too, because they're getting data on the progress of students as they're moving through high schools. Well, the school system has all these different databases, but they're not organized in a way that you could actually easily see the flow of a student through the system. So even if the evidence exists, it's not organized in a way to support improvement work. And unfortunately, in many cases, you have to actually invent what we call these practical measures to inform improvement, because they just don't exist in our system.
Huge difference between the sectors. With that, I'd like to transition to our two discussants. We're again joined by Elizabeth Moshi, Dean of the School of Education, Karen Stolber, great friend of the Learning Health Systems Collaboratory. Elizabeth, I'm wondering if you can offer a few comments on Tony's talk.
Well, thank you, Don, and thank you to the Learning Health Sciences group for including me in this, and especially thank you, Tony, both for your incredible talk and just for who you are and always have been as a scholar. It's just such an honor to be part of this conversation. You've been a role model for me in my own work to try to put my research and the research of so many others in our field into action in Detroit. Your early work in Chicago has been a key source of inspiration for me, especially in terms of the way you took really seriously the work that has to be done to translate research into practice. So many scholars just expect that they're going to do their research and then it'll just get taken up by practitioners, and they don't think about the different practices and discourses and demands of those spaces that give life to the very difference between research and practice. And by contrast, your work just took those differences really seriously, and you rolled up your sleeves and got into schools and learned from and with practitioners. And I'll never forget the day, you probably don't remember this, but the day when I visited with a collaborative team from University of Chicago, and populated by members, teachers, leaders, researchers, all talking about how to make their system better. And so it's just inspirational to see how you were walking the talk of getting better at what organizations do, and at helping researchers and teachers and school leaders craft and stay focused on outcomes and goals. That idea that you talked about of being really problem focused and user centered. I got to see it in action, and I never forgot that. And that was actually close to 20 years ago, but I carried that with me throughout my own work in Detroit. So it's not at all a stretch to say that the work that we're doing with the school at Marygrove and the Detroit P20 partnership really was inspired by your work in Chicago, virtually every way. It's a truly collaborative, collective impact model, which I saw demonstrated when I visited and when I read the accounts of that work. It's a focus on the entire system and shifting the traditional system in those problem-focused, user-centered, and evidence-driven ways. And that means that although we began with a focus on developing empowered and empowering educators through our teaching school model, where we're drawing from the medical school model, we soon learned that we needed to take on collaboratively crafting empowering curricula and empowering environments. In other words, we couldn't expect novice teachers and teachers in the induction phase to really learn in powerful ways if in fact we weren't collaborating on every level. And that enables our teachers to do their best teaching and children to do their best learning. It also required us to, as you said, embrace measurement. We had to really hold ourselves accountable. And so we're talking about empowering evaluations that really push us to be better. And that kind of leads into the continuous improvement, because of course you couldn't leave it at building a great system in Chicago. You had to take it to the next level, throw down the gauntlet and say, it's not just about getting better, but it's about continuously getting better. And we took that seriously, and we're working right now to build those data systems that someone in the audience asked about, because they don't really exist in just as you said, and to really build a partnership in which we're all gathering the data together around the problems of practice that matter and around what the users of the data need. So that is, a key dimension of our work, but I do have a lot of questions for you. So I would love if we have time to hear you talk about some of these questions or just to put them on the table. So the first question is, how do we manage the tension between needing to show ourselves as proficient because we're a growing enterprise. We're, the jury is out and the stakes are high. So how do we manage that tension between needing to do that and to look good, but also needing to recognize our flaws and continuously get better? When all eyes are on us, how do we name the struggles, the mistakes, and the bumps without undermining our efforts? And leading people to think maybe we don't know what we're doing. So I recognize continuous improvement doesn't mean donning hair shirts and telling the world where we messed up, but it seems to be human nature to want to focus on our strengths and to not dwell on or showcase our weaknesses. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about how to manage that tension and embrace improvement in addition, as a goal, in addition to the goal of, really producing powerfully proficient students and the best teachers who stay in the profession. So that's the first question. Simple question. The second question has to do with networks and that notion of building a network. It's incredibly important. You didn't, I think, talk about this as much, but what I really like about the notion of a network is it takes us away from the idea of everything having to scale in the sense that things have to just move from one space and be plopped in to another space, but rather allows us to understand the importance of the place-based nature of the work that we do, of these systemic approaches, and to learn from our differences as well as to share our strategies. So I really like that. And I like the notion of a network giving us partners from whom we can learn and with whom we can share our ideas. But networking is really hard. We're still working to build a network just within our space in one Detroit community. So, how do we do that? How do we take a massive collective impact model and then try to reach out to others who might be doing that? How do you manage relationships across all of these different systems? So I'd love to hear you talk about that as well. And then finally, who or what counts as a player in the networked community? So we're working to build this powerful education system within a public school system. So is our networked community other schools in the larger system? Or is it other schools like ours in different communities across the state and nation? Is it neighborhood and city entities with whom we might be partnering to build our system? Is it medical systems because we're trying to draw from medical models of education? So is it Michigan Medicine? Is it other medical schools? And is it possibly all of these? And if so, then how do we pick and choose? How do we decide where and with whom to network as we start to organize these networks? So I'm going to stop here with all of these questions and instead, again, thank you for your years of scholarship, your leadership in improvement science, and the commitment that you clearly have to children's learning, teachers teaching, and leaders leading. I don't know if the group gathered here really understands just how fragmented and disconnected education is as an enterprise. And so what you're doing is a project of great perseverance, patience, and deep collaborative spirit. And I really applaud you for that. Everything that we know about networked systems and improvement science really comes from the community that you've built, Tony. So many, many thanks for the work that you've done. And thank you for sharing your brilliance with us today.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for your comments and your questions. I have them down, and time permitting, we'll take up several of them. But before we do, I'm sure that we'll get some insights and possibly some questions from Karen as well. So I'd like to welcome Karen Stahlberg and hand you the mic.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I will just echo Dean Moji's comments, which it really is a privilege and a rare opportunity to be able to be here together with everyone. When I was at the School of Education, one of the things that I realized was that we were all speaking the same, we were talking about the same concepts, but using different language. And so while listening to your talk, Dr. Breck, I made some kind of crosswalks between what you were saying and how we in the Department of Learning Health Sciences consider learning health systems, as well as the relevance to health professions education, and really to teacher preparation, which is very much akin to healthcare provider preparation. And so I heard a lot of things on sort of meso micro, meso, and meta levels. And I'm going to jump around just a little bit because of time. But, you know, for the first thing, when you talk about your 6 core principles for improvement, I mean, for us, that really resonates around the learning health system loop, which is performance to data and data to knowledge and knowledge to performance. And so that links into healthcare processes and improvement processes such as root cause analyses, structural solutions, the work at New Visions, you know, creating dashboards and being able to create information to the right people at the right time is something that we're very much working on. The work at Menomonee struck me as part of our interprofessional education and interprofessional practice focus. And so Michigan Medicine is in the midst of high reliability organizational training, which is across the entire structure. Thinking about how do we communicate, how do we find problems and solutions together. Skipping a little bit to health professions education and the New Visions work, those of us in medical education think about competency committees and milestones for our learners across the continuum of undergraduate medical education, graduate medical education, and continuing professional development. So I see lots of synergies there. We have been using predictive modeling and learning analytics through medical education, but also here on campus. And then the other thing that struck me is the using sources tool for how to teach writing is very much akin to our laparoscopic surgery curriculum, where the Society of General Surgeons came together and said, here is a standardized curriculum that we all can agree on about how you should be a laparoscopic surgeon. And then it has been applied in our clinical simulation centers. And it has become sort of the way to do things, even though many of us surgeons think, you know, we have the best way to do it, and there's only one way, which is our way. but really, there's competencies there, right? And then I really like the idea of the high-tech high with teachers as designers, because in our own medical school curriculum, I think about our branches curriculum and how as constructivists, our learners are able to work together with our faculty to find a path towards a degree that fits in with their future work as physicians. And then finally, I really do see this connection between teachers and students as a dyad and providers and patients as a dyad, and really how that all kind of gels together. So I know we're a little short for time, so I'm going to hold right there, but thank you so much, because I've had such a great time listening and thinking, and it's just a pleasure to be here with everyone.
Thank you, Karen. Tony, I'd like to direct you to the second of Elizabeth's question. Elizabeth was talking about the challenge of building networks to do this type of work. And that's a matter that, at least in my participation in the Learning Health Systems Collaboratory events, has shown up. The work that you were just describing and so much of the work of the LHS doesn't happen within institutionalized conventional organizational forms, but in newly created networks. And this pushes people who are deeply engaged, typically in problem solving and service provision, into the work of organization building. And for them, it's often quite new. I'm wondering if you could say a few words in response to Elizabeth's question about the work of building networks.
Well, it's not simple work. It involves long-term, I think, commitments, because it's based on relationships that have evolved and relationships of trust. Part of why the New Visions, the National Writing Project, rather, case is so interesting, is because it helps to illumine the power of standing professional networks, and where people know each other, they have so they didn't have a common language about this particular problem, they do share a set of understandings about the work they're engaged in, and these structures that connect people can operate so that you have an incredible capacity when an environment like that exists as part of the infrastructure of education, to then put a problem into it and accelerate progress on that problem, as contrasted with the case where you're starting from scratch and you've got to build this network up. We did that with the early work at the foundation. Actually the first big problem we tackled with these high failure rates in developmental math courses in community colleges, which is actually function as an almost absolute gatekeepered opportunity. Couldn't get to a four-year institution. If you couldn't get through that, you couldn't qualify for a lot of vocational technical programs in the community college except through that. And we had to build a network of faculty to take on this problem. And we changed the success rates. Only 5% of students were getting through this hurdle in 1 year to an excess of 50% of the students getting through this hurdle in 1 year. But the building of the network to solve this problem from scratch, well, that was like a $40 million undertaking. That's how much we raised over 8 years to do this kind of work. And I just say that because one of the things that you've written a lot about, Don, is about what an infrastructure for instructional improvement would look like. And as I think about that problem, these are not, while we may have specific projects like, well, we really need to focus on argument writing, you might call that an improvement project. We need standing capacities to be able to attack problems like this. And this is a place when you think about this as truly a paradigm shift. We don't tend to think about building capacities for improvement. We fund projects. We don't fund infrastructure. And this is a place where networks as infrastructure would be an incredible valuable resource, particularly in that question about how are we going to accelerate our progress for the problems in the future that we don't yet know we have to tackle.
Thank you, Tony. We're nearing the end of our time together. I'd like to thank Tony for joining us today. I'd like to thank Elizabeth and Karen for your contributions, your thoughts, and your questions. And I'd especially like to thank everybody who took time out of their very busy days to join us for this session. As you exit, you'll see a link to a post-event survey. We're very interested in your feedback, so please complete that. There's a recording for this session that will be made available to everybody on the LHS Collaboratory website. So please go looking for that and share it with colleagues. And we look forward to everybody joining us at our next Collaboratory event. This will be in January 21st, I believe, of 2021. And in the meantime, please, everybody, stay safe, stay healthy, and between the cracks of all that you do, find time to enjoy a festive and restorative holiday season. We look forward to seeing you again in January. Again, thank you, everybody.